With the 9/11 attacks not even a month old, George W. Bush ordered U.S. forces into Afghanistan with the expressed mission to stomp out the Taliban. The war on terror ousted the extremist group in a matter of weeks. But 18 years and tens of thousands of casualties later, the Taliban went from hiding in caves to the negotiating table. During the past 6 weeks, representatives from both sides have met in Qatar. They've outlined a broad plan for a battle-weary U.S. to withdraw and reportedly save face. But many questions stand in the way of the deal. What kind of role will the Taliban have in government? Will it even respect the current leadership, which it sees as American puppets? And how can the U.S. be sure that once it leaves, the Taliban won't go back on the offensive? Well, there might not be much time to find the answers. Critics warn that an unpredictable Donald Trump could pull U.S. forces out with a single tweet, even if the Afghan army can't defend the country. Well, let's jump right into our debate now. In Kabul, we have Javid Faisal, who was a deputy spokesman for Afghanistan's chief executive, Abdullah. In Washington, D.C., David Sedney, he's a former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Afghanistan, Pakistan and Central Asia. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. Javid Faisal, for those who say that the United States right now is handing over the country to the Taliban, your response is what?
First of all, let me correct that I used to be a spokesperson to the government. Now, the views that I will be expressing are purely my own, not representing Afghan government. I believe Afghanistan belongs to the Afghan people. Afghanistan was there before the U.S. Afghanistan will be there after the U.S. and we will remain in Afghanistan. If Afghanistan is going to be left to someone, it's the Afghan people. It's not Taliban or the foreigners or the Pakistanis. It's our country, and we will be left with our country. One thing I want to just have a point at is Taliban, you mentioned, are winning from caves to the negotiation table. I think it's a win for the Afghan people, for the Afghan government, and for our partners, because we were asking Taliban to come to the peace talks from day one. We told them to come out of their caves and talk to the Afghan people, sit like good humans do. Finally, when there are some lights for peace talks, I think this is good, and this could be a success for the peace process in Afghanistan and for the Afghan government and our partners who have been pushing Taliban to come to the peace talks. So I think it will be a win for us.
David Sedney, is it a win for the Afghan people? Do you agree with Javid Faisal?
I believe it has the potential to be a win for the Afghan people. But as the U.S. negotiator, as Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad said, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. I also want to correct something you said at the start of the program. The United States did not go into Afghanistan to destroy the Taliban. The United States went into Afghanistan to try and destroy al-Qaeda and to stop future attacks on the U.S. The Taliban were never the enemy. The Taliban were the host for the enemy. If the Taliban are prepared to disavow al-Qaeda, to fight against al-Qaeda, to fight against Daesh, the Islamic State.
Okay, but I mean, that's semantics, Mr. Sedney. At the time, the Taliban harbored al-Qaeda. The Taliban wasn't going to hand over bin Laden. And the U.S. was pretty clear. We're going to kick you out of the country. We want regime change. That's why they spoke about women's rights and overthrowing this system. 18 years later, isn't it a bit disingenuous to say the Taliban was never our enemy, it was only al-Qaeda?
Not at all, because if you look back at what happened, the Taliban were not our enemy. They were the host of the enemy. And that's an important difference. The Taliban are Afghans, just as the government in Kabul and all the people in the cities and provinces of Afghanistan are Afghans. And the most important thing for peace is for the Afghans to sit down together. The refusal of the Taliban to sit down with the government so far has been what has prevented peace for the last 18 years. As my colleague just said, the Afghan government has sought talks with the Taliban from the very beginning. It's good that their talks are happening in Qatar with the Taliban in the United States, but it's not sufficient for peace. What would be sufficient and necessary for peace is talks among all Afghans. And that is what the challenge is now, for the Afghans to sit down with each other. The Taliban have to agree to sit down, and the Afghan government and all the political forces in Afghanistan, including those that are not part of the current government, they need to agree on all Afghan approach to talks that will then bring full peace to the country.
Okay, let's bring in our third guest now and go to Tampa, Florida. Murid Partaw represented Afghanistan at the U.S. Central Command, which oversees American military operations in the region. Murid, looking at the long timeline, 18 years on, the fact that the Taliban's at the table, the fact that the Taliban controls large parts of the country, was this inevitable?
This was to some extent because the Taliban, unfortunately, gained their momentum during the nearly 2 decades of war in Afghanistan. And remember, the reconciliation was from the very beginning. From the very beginning, even during President Karzai, when he was elected as the president in 2009 for the second term, he initiated an Afghan peace process. But back then, the situation was still militarily, not in favor of the Afghan security forces and Afghan government. Despite the presence of 120,000, U.S. and allied forces, we were not able to sort of clear Afghanistan from the Taliban. So I think going forward, political settlement negotiation is the only forward, because we have tried the military option for the last 15, 16 years, and it has failed. So the only option right now going forward would be a political solution. And I concur with what Sedney said. The Taliban are all Afghans, and there needs to be a comprehensive dialogue, intra-Afghan comprehensive dialogue between the Afghan government and the Taliban.
Okay.
But that's also problematic, because the Taliban do not want to talk to the Afghan government. I think the Afghan government should allow the Taliban at this point to resolve their differences with the United States, and then enter negotiations with the Afghan government. So it's fair to say that the Taliban have some core differences with the United States.
Yes.
The US is
okay. Ahmed, let me come in here for a second. Let me come in here for a second and bring in Javid. So Javid, everybody seems to be on the same page that nobody wants the war to continue. Nobody wants the war to endure. Yes, the Taliban is different from Daesh or Al-Qaeda because they are, to use that term that Karzai likes to use, sons of the soil, right? And there's a general belief that the Taliban must be included in any future government. But who gets to bend for whom? Do you roll back all the developments over the past 18 years on democracy, on human rights, on women's rights, and so on, in order to accommodate the Taliban? Or does the Taliban have to finally say, okay, some of the stuff that we actually profess and some of the stuff that we use as rules of governance over the people that we govern over is wrong, and we need to stop that? Who gets to bend for whom?
I think when we talk about the peace process or the recent developments that we have had and heard of from Qatar, I think those are good. We are happy. But in the same time, we have legitimate concerns too. We know that the Taliban are Afghans. They are, like you mentioned, the sons of the soil. But unfortunately, they were the guys and they are the guys who have been getting used as tools for foreign policy objectives of countries in our neighborhood, which is our biggest concern. They were used to be their tool. They still are their tool. And if there are no guarantees in the future, they will be used as tools again. So this is our concern. But in the same time, I believe Taliban and their supporters should have realized today's Afghanistan is different than the Afghanistan it was 18 years ago, 20 years ago. My generation is different. My values are different than the values we used to have during Taliban. I believe Taliban should be realizing that women's rights is something that cannot be compromised. The independence, the freedom of speech is something that cannot be compromised. The national unity is something that cannot be compromised. And there has to be guarantees that Taliban do accept these facts, that Taliban do accept the changed Afghanistan, the new Afghanistan, which is a better Afghanistan. You know, I want peace. My generation, my life has all been in war. So we want peace, but we do have red lines. We do have values that cannot be compromised often. And in the same time, I, as an Afghan, expect our partners to have some obligations upon our neighbors in the region. When we hear about some rumors coming out of the peace talks, there are obligations on Afghanistan. There are obligations on Pakistan and also on the US. But the Pakistan, that is the main part of the problem, which is creating the problem, has no obligations.
Okay.
This is something that should be looked into.
Okay. That's an interesting
point. There is
point.
no
Okay.
guarantee
Okay. You mentioned
Pakistan and
Pakistan
Taliban are
directly.
going to respect this
Certainly.
in the future.
Certainly. Okay, so let me ask David Sedney, how much more important does a country like Pakistan become now as we move from this phase of war into making peace, given that Pakistan has been blamed for arming and funding the Taliban over the past few years?
Pakistan does not become important or any more important because it has always been of paramount importance. The U.S. ambassador, U.S. special negotiator, Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad, had been very clear about that for the previous 15 years. In fact, his appointment was seen as a problem by the people in Pakistan. But over the talks over the last several months, it's become clear that there is some possibility that Pakistan is changing its position. Its release of the Taliban #2 person who they arrested 8 years ago, Mullah Baradar, is a major sign that something is changing. With Mr. Baradar becoming both the deputy head of the Taliban and chief of the negotiating team in Doha, I think there are signs of compromise on the side of the Taliban as well. In the past, the Taliban had insisted on victory, the return of the Islamic Emirate to power. It appears that's no longer the case. So I think we're seeing compromises on all sides.
Ahmed, do you trust the Pakistanis that they will compromise and sincerely want peace?
It's difficult to trust the Pakistanis because they are Pakistanis pursuing a geopolitical game in Afghanistan, and it makes it very complicated, you know, to trust. And the Taliban have been used. There's no doubt that you know, in pursuit of those geopolitical interests that Pakistan is pursuing with respect to Afghanistan. But right now that Afghanistan has changed, and certainly the Taliban has changed, there is a lot of, you know, right now a transformation within the Taliban leadership too, you know, with the appointment of Mullah Baradar coming to the Qatar office soon. Sometimes, you know, I think there will be some, you know, concessions from the Taliban side too. You know, they are fully aware that it's a transformed Afghanistan. You know, some values are not going to be negotiable, and you know, and they are also well aware that the U.S. has been pretty clear that if they want to talk, you know, the U.S. will talk, and if they are going to fight, the U.S. is also you know, going to fight. So at this point, you know, both sides, it's a tough decision. Both sides have to make, you know, concessions, and of course, in realization of the fact that Afghanistan has fully transformed during the last 18 years, and there has to be a political solution. You know, the consensus, you know, within Afghanistan and outside of Afghanistan, which is a good thing, which is a very, you know, good development, is that you know, you have to end this war through political means. Eventually, all wars have to end through political means, and the Afghan conflict is not an exception in this case. So there is a consensus that, you know, that we have to negotiate, and both sides are. There have been some progress, you know, in recent talks that Ambassador Khalilzad had in Qatar. And as I mentioned, that at this point, the Afghan government should allow the Taliban.
Understood.
I know.
Understood. Yeah.
Last time there were some spoilers,
right?
But you know, because the U.S. is a very important party to this conflict.
Right.
The Taliban.
And Ahmed, I want to bring in David Sedney here to look at it from a very cynical perspective, right? When we see that about 15 million people in Afghanistan are either living under the Taliban or live in areas where the Taliban have been able to frequently mount attacks. and we look at the other side, the side that the United States and his allies has pumped with billions of dollars in training and weapons and so on, right? The security forces, President Ghani's own security forces turning their guns on leaders in the country, being infiltrated by the Taliban and others, and President Ghani's own admission that over the past 4 years or so, 45,000 security forces have died in this conflict. When we look at it from that perspective, is it a case of the United States saying, we screwed this up, it's time to cut and run?
No, that's not the case, and your facts are wrong. The Taliban control perhaps 5 to 6 million Afghan areas where Afghans.
As I said, 15 million either living under Taliban control or in places where the Taliban is regularly mounting attacks.
Well, the Taliban are regularly mounting attacks throughout the entire country because as an insurgency, they can do that. But actually, the Taliban have lost the percentage of the people. Fewer numbers of people are controlled by the Taliban than were 4 years ago. On the security forces, yes, there have been severe losses on the part of the Afghan security forces, but the Taliban's losses have been even greater. But the biggest loss in Afghanistan has been to civilians. The number of civilians killed over the last 4 years has been much greater than at any other time in this war, although much less than during the civil war of the 1990s. That loss of Afghan civilians and the fact that the Taliban have been killing Afghan civilians has led to some dissension in the Taliban ranks. Taliban fighters are asking, why are we killing so many Afghan civilians? So there is a pressure for peace even inside the Taliban itself. Mullah Baradar, when he was still the number 2 in the Taliban, before he was arrested by Pakistan in 2010, had started the process of having peace talks with former President Karzai. Mm-hmm. He clearly represents those in the Taliban who are pragmatic and want peace. So I think his appointment is something you cannot underestimate the importance of. This is not really a question of winning and losing, because at this point, everybody involved in this war has lost. The question is finding a sustainable peace, and I think it is the wrong approach to look at this as a win-lose situation.
Right. Javid Faisal, as somebody who was an advisor to Abdullah, as somebody who was running for office very recently, as somebody involved in politics in Afghanistan, you're in the know, you're plugged into the system. Are you able to, if I had to ask you, are you able to distinguish between good Taliban and bad Taliban? Are you able to tell me, okay, those are the guys I won't talk to, and these are the guys I'll talk to. I have their numbers. They're on WhatsApp. Are you able to do that?
I think this is something Pakistanis could better answer, the good Taliban and bad Taliban. But for us, the people that are Afghans and willing to join the peace process are most welcomed. We have always appealed for peace. We always wanted them to leave their caves, to not be the proxy forces of others, to come to join us for a better future of Afghanistan. So those who are willing to join, they are most welcomed. They are the good people, especially if they can ensure that they no longer get used by others for their own objectives. Afghanistan should come first for them. We should have a future together with them. Both sides should agree on a peaceful agreement, because we have had enough of a fight. Neither they could win nor us through fight. So now if there is a win, it is a win for Afghanistan. It's for everybody. Mainly it's for the Afghan civilians who have been the primary victims of this terrorism in Afghanistan. But in the same time, it's very, very important to assure an intra-Afghan dialogue, because that's the only way forward, and that's
what I'm asking you, Javid.
That can pave the road
dialogue, right?
for a lasting peace in Afghanistan.
Certainly, this thing sounds good. We're talking about intra-Afghan dialogue, but I ask you again, do you know who the moderate Taliban are? Those who you would be having that dialogue with, who you'd be sitting down with, and those who would be involved in the government in some sort of unity government down the road?
I think, again, the ones that are willing today to come to the peace process, we cannot ignore the fact that there are several factions and groups of Taliban, but the ones that are willing to join the peace process, we do have some lights of them. The ones that were represented in Qatar are the ones that are reconcilable, the ones that could be part of a better future for Afghanistan. So with them, we make peace. The ones that are still not willing to join the peace process, we do not have any other option than to face them and make sure that we finally have peace in Afghanistan. I think the majority of Taliban are willing to come to the peace process. They have had enough of fight. They have had enough losses and casualties, and their numbers of casualties are way more higher than the casualties of the Afghan civilians or the Afghan national security forces. So they could not win through that. Their only solution is to come to the peace talks and have a future for themselves in Afghanistan and secure a future for the Afghan people too.
Okay. Ahmed, General Mattis, who's, of course, no longer within the Trump administration, said a U.S. withdrawal would unleash 20 terror groups. He was not happy with the prospect. Is he right that a U.S. withdrawal might unleash chaos?
I think he's quite right. He's quite right. Yes, we know that a precipitous withdrawal from Afghanistan will have, unintended consequences. There's no deal yet. We are in the initial process. It's a process. It's not going to take. Events are not going to be shaping overnight. We are talking of a very lengthy process with respect to Afghan, negotiations. I think we have to give that time. At this point, any withdrawal, because without a solid deal from the Taliban and from the neighboring countries, from their supporters, I think it will be a huge mistake. That will create a security vacuum, inside Afghanistan, and turn Afghanistan into a chaotic, place as like 1990s. We will see the fragmentation of the Afghan security forces. Once, of course, if you withdraw, forces from Afghanistan, and also with more importantly the assistances, the monetary assistances that the U.S. and coalition forces are paying for Afghanistan is very essential and vital. So I think the U.S. and allies must be very careful in this regard.
Okay.
Unless there is a solid deal, as I mentioned, a solid deal from the Taliban, from the neighboring countries, any withdrawals, specifically precipitous withdrawal, will turn Afghanistan into those dark days that we have. We know how to do dark days.
Okay.
It is dark days.
Okay, Ahmed, we're out of time. And what we do know for now is Khalilzad saying there's a draft framework for peace. That's all we know. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens from here on in. We'll be watching this very closely. But gentlemen, it's been a pleasure tapping into all of your expertise. Javid Faisal, David Sedney, and Ahmad Murid Partaw. Thanks for joining us.